And this is not clickbait. This is truly an American Volga. More precisely, the Volga Cyber, a Russian car built on an American platform with foreign engines and a Soviet-era name. The project was meant to bring the Volga brand back into the upper segment of the post-Soviet market. But instead of restoring its former status, the Volga Cyber became the last, and not the most successful, model ever sold under the Volga name. But let's take this step by step. This is a continuation of the Volga story. In the previous video, I covered its history from 1956 to 2008. Despite numerous attempts over the years to launch a fundamentally new model into production, by 2008, the Volga being built was, in reality, a deeply modernized version of the old 24. Very little remained of its former status. Instead of a mid-level official service car, the Volga had become a pale shadow of itself, an outdated vehicle of interest mainly to older buyers. In 2005, the management of the Gorky Automobile Plant officially announced plans to remove the Volga from the production line in the near future and focus on commercial vehicles instead. From an economic standpoint, this decision looked logical. By that point, it was clear that the model was both morally and technically outdated and had exhausted its potential. However, public sentiment was not so straightforward. Many believed that the Volga deserved a more dignified ending. There was also widespread frustration with the fact that, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new owners of industrial enterprises were perceived as creating little of their own and instead dismantling what they had inherited. The decision to discontinue the Volga fell squarely into this wave of public dissatisfaction. The logic was simple. No truly new car had been created, and now the old one was being removed as well. As a result, under pressure from public sentiment, it was announced that the Volga would, after all, have a continuation. At the same time, the plant had no funds to develop a fully original car from scratch. As a result, the Gorky Automobile Plant chose a familiar and already proven path, purchasing a ready-made design abroad. This was not about acquiring individual technologies or a prototype. The goal was to buy a complete technological platform as a whole, one that could be transferred and put into series production relatively quickly. The choice fell on the second-generation Chrysler Sebring of the 2000 model year. It was a relatively modern American car which, in terms of class and overall purpose, suited the role of a new Volga quite well. The choice of an American partner was not accidental. The history of the Gorky Automobile Plant began with cooperation with the United States. In 1932, the Soviet Union purchased a license and the full production tooling for the Ford Model A, followed shortly by the Ford Model AA. These vehicles became Gaz's first mass-produced cars. In this sense, the factory was, in a way, returning to its origins. The deal between the Russian and American sides was finalized in 2006. In addition to the license for the vehicle itself, the Gorky Automobile Plant acquired the complete assembly line, along with the engineering documentation. The purchase cost approximately $150 million, with another $140 million invested in additional equipment and preparation of the production facilities in Nizhny Novgorod. The new car was initially named Gaz Sibir and later renamed Volga Sibir. The name Sibir was derived from the word Siberia. Naturally, the American platform required adaptation to Russian operating conditions. However, the scale of these changes was relatively modest. Unlike the adaptation of the Fiat 124, which underwent hundreds of engineering changes before becoming the Lada, the Volga Sibir required far fewer modifications. The springs and shock absorbers were revised, making the suspension more energy-absorbing. Ground clearance increased by 25 millimeters, and the characteristic body sway typical of the American version was eliminated. Externally, the car was also slightly updated, receiving new bumpers and revised lighting. The Chrysler Sebring originally offered several engine options and multiple types of transmissions. For the Russian version, this variety was considered excessive. As a result, the Volga Sibir was equipped with a single four-cylinder, 16-valve engine with a displacement of 2.4 liters, producing 143 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed automatic transmission. This classic American automatic transmission was not particularly quick in its operation. An acceleration from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour took approximately 13.4 seconds. Later, a version with a manual transmission was added to the lineup. This made the car slightly cheaper and somewhat more dynamic, reducing the 0 to 100 time to around 11.5 seconds. The interior did not offer any particular luxury, but for a D-segment car, it was perfectly acceptable. Even in the base configuration, the Volga Sibir came equipped with 2 airbags, power steering, air conditioning, ABS, an audio system with 6 speakers, and a driver's seat with electric adjustment. In the Luxe trim level, this list was expanded to include leather upholstery and fog lights. Series production of the new Volga began in the summer of 2008. The base version was priced at $21,000. The new Volga was received calmly by both buyers and the press. There was no serious criticism, but the car also failed to generate much enthusiasm. The problem was that by this time, American cars were no longer seen as benchmarks of quality or as trendsetters in automotive design. At the same time, during the Soviet period, domestic car development had often looked specifically to the American auto industry for inspiration, and this was neither hidden nor denied, and was sometimes even emphasized. For example, in 1932, the Soviet side effectively copied the Buick 3290. The car received the official name Leningrad First, and the press greeted it enthusiastically, calling it the Red Buick, and stressing that it was in no way inferior to its overseas original. This approach continued later as well, although Soviet engineers gradually moved away from direct copying and instead drew inspiration from American automotive design. By the 2000s, however, the situation had changed. In Russia of the 2000s, the Chrysler Sebring was perceived more as an exotic model and did not enjoy strong demand, unlike Japanese and European cars. The Toyota Camry and Skoda Superb firmly occupied leading positions in the D segment. Close behind them were the Ford Mondeo and the Volkswagen Passat. These models cost only slightly more than the new Volga, while their sales were measured in tens of thousands of units. In addition, ambitious Korean manufacturers were actively entering the market, offering sedans that could, in terms of their role, be described as a kind of Korean Volga, while being cheaper than their European and Japanese competitors. Nevertheless, Gaz's marketing team expected to compete in this segment. It was assumed that, alongside price, patriotic considerations would influence potential buyers and encourage them to choose the Volga. There were also expectations tied to corporate customers and government agencies, which had traditionally purchased Gaz vehicles since Soviet times. The production plans were correspondingly ambitious. It was expected that 10,000 Volga Sibir cars would be built in the first year, with output projected to exceed 60,000 units annually in the near future. But reality turned out to be far harsher than the marketers had expected. Over the first 2 years, only around 3,000 cars were produced, with a significant share purchased by the state for police and other government services. Exports to nearby post-Soviet markets, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, brought only marginal results. European, Japanese, and Korean cars dominated there as well, leaving the Volga with little room to compete. Exports to Western Europe were never seriously considered. The situation there was similar. The Volga simply had nothing to offer Western European buyers. Moreover, in the 1990s and 2000s, American cars in Europe were perceived much the same way the Volga was perceived at home. Many carried once famous names that had symbolized prestige and progress 20 or 30 years earlier, but by that point looked outdated and disconnected from contemporary automotive trends. In this sense, a Chrysler-based Volga was non-competitive from the outset. The timing only made matters worse. In September 2008, the global financial crisis struck, and the already modest demand nearly collapsed. Sales recovered slightly a year later, and the plant produced another roughly 5,000 cars. But by then, the project was beyond saving. In the summer of 2010, production of the Volga Sibir was permanently halted. A total of 8,952 cars were built. There is a certain symbolism in this ending. The Gorky Automobile Plant began its history through cooperation with American partners, and it was on an American platform that the story of Volga passenger cars came to an end. The plant itself, however, did not disappear. Along with the Volga, only Gaz's passenger car division was closed. a segment that had been unprofitable for decades. The company ultimately focused on commercial and heavy vehicles, a direction it continues to follow today. As for the Volga itself, its American chapter left mixed impressions. On the one hand, it was a genuine attempt to pull the brand back from the margins and return it to the center of the post-Soviet automotive market. On the other, the number of cars produced and the overall outcome of the project inevitably leave a bitter aftertaste. Did the Sibir have a chance to become a successful car? Most likely, yes. Had it not entered the market at the height of the financial crisis and had it been priced slightly lower. In essence, it was a genuinely decent car, offering a good level of comfort and acceptable reliability. However, buyers preferred to spend their money not on a Russian American, but on Japanese, European, and Korean models. Perhaps the new model should not have been launched under the Volga name at all, but, for example, as the Gaz Sibir. The target audience for the Sibir simply had no memory of the era when Volga symbolized prestige. For them, the name was already associated with an old, cheap, and frankly pensioner-oriented car. The marketers likely assumed that a familiar brand would act as a magnet for buyers, but that assumption proved wrong. And just as the classic Volga faded away quietly and almost unnoticed, without ceremonies or honors, its American counterpart left the production line in the same unremarkable manner. The Volga brand left history forever.